Chapter 21 is looking at the New Deal, which will last from 1932 to about 1940. This is the federal government's response to the Great Depression, and it really does offer Americans a new deal in which you have a very activist federal government that is engaging directly with the economy in order to alleviate the plight that many Americans are feeling, including joblessness, homelessness, and so on. And while many of its detractors at the time labeled it as socialism, most historians today agree that not only was it not socialism, but it actually served to save American capitalism. So this is going to represent a fundamental shift in American government involvement in the economy, and one that in most respects still persists today. Number one, what were the major policy initiatives of the New Deal in the 100 Days? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, was elected over President Herbert Hoover in 1932. He had promised on the campaign trail to offer the American people a new deal. And he not only wins in a presidential landslide, but his party, the Democrats, also picked up significant majorities in Congress as well, which made passage of many of these New Deal policies pretty easy. Worth noting here is that FDR had polio and was confined to a wheelchair for much of his presidency, but most Americans had no idea because it was rare that he was photographed in his wheelchair. Instead, he'd be photographed behind his desk or essentially propped up behind a podium. So most Americans really were not aware of this, but I believe that it's worth noting that his own personal hardship probably created some sympathy or some empathy for others who were suffering during the Depression. Now, FDR's first New Deal or first 100 days was really influenced by past progressive traditions, especially that of an activist government that is involved in the economy in order to try to provide for the public good. Uh, First, here we go. All right. The first program worth noting is that FDR's New Deal in the first 100 days attempted to rescue and reform the US banking system. He first declares a bank holiday to shore up banks and prevent runs on the banks, which further imperiled their health. And in that time, the federal government and these businesses would assess their health, determining which would be able to stay open and which would have their assets divided among other banks. Um, It'll also try to prevent the banking collapse from happening again by establishing the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. And this will federally insure bank deposits up to a certain amount, meaning that if the bank loses your money or the bank closes its doors, the federal government will pay you back what you lost up to a certain amount. And I believe the original amount was $2,500, which was far more than the average American had in their savings account at the time. To give you some perspective, I believe the modern level to which your deposits are insured are something like $250,000. Again, that's going to cover just about every American because most people don't have that much money in the bank. Secondly, we've got the National Industrial Recovery Act, which establishes the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, no relation to the National Rifle Association of modern times. And the goal here for the NRA was to eliminate cutthroat competition by bringing industry, labor, and government together to create codes of fair practices and fair conduct and to help set prices. And compliant businesses could sport the blue eagle symbol of the NRA, which claimed that that company, we do our part. Third, the first 100 days established the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA. And this made grants to local agencies in the states to give direct aid to the poor, something that the Hoover administration had resisted as an unearned handout the people who were, say, homeless or starving or out of work or anything like that. So the New Deal reverses that kind of policy as the federal government begins to engage in direct aid, although allowing states a considerable amount of discretion as to how that money is actually spent. Fourth, an important one here, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men in rural works projects like building parks and engaging in forest preservation and things of that nature. Other agencies later on, like the Public Works Administration and the Civil Works Administration, will also pursue the same kinds of goals that the CCC is, and namely, that is creating jobs for people to do. So the federal government will literally make up these organizations to give unemployed workers jobs and then pay them with a government check that allows them to spend that money and help the economy recover because they're putting money back into the economy for everything from housing expenses to food to anything else. Now, the government in doing this is spending itself into debt. It's writing checks for money that it doesn't have. But the theory is, and we'll get into more of this later, that once that money goes out, people will spend it, the economy will recover, and that means that the federal government will be able to collect more taxes because more people will qualify to pay income taxes, and that's going to allow them to pay off that debt over time. But in the short term, it's putting people back to work and trying to drive down that 25% unemployment rate caused by the Great Depression. Fifth, we have the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, and this built a series of dams and hydroelectric plants to prevent flooding and to provide electricity to a rural 7-state region. It'll serve as an experiment in regional planning, but it's also going to create a considerable amount of jobs for people in the construction and maintenance of these dams and hydroelectric plants, while also, again, providing cheap electricity to rural areas that didn't have access to it before. Sixth, another pretty important one is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, a pretty controversial program in the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, I should say, was a pretty controversial program. The intent here was to raise farm prices by limiting production. So they're going to drive down the supply so that the value of crops and livestock and other agricultural products goes up, meaning that farmers can collect more money when they sell it at market. In order to encourage limiting production, the federal government actually paid farmers to not harvest crops or even to destroy and plow over crops, paid them to dump out milk, to slaughter livestock. And again, this is heavily criticized because this is a time of hunger and we are literally destroying food. That said, the AAA is successful, and in a relatively short amount of time, farm prices go up, and that benefits the agricultural sector and the many Americans who were farmers at the time. Speaking of farmers, we should probably mention the Dust Bowl, which is a natural disaster that occurred around the same time of the Great Depression, or so in the 1930s, and it displaces more than 1 million farmers from across, well, mainly 5 plain states that had suffered a 9-year drought, but had continued plowing anyway, which loosened the soil across literally millions of acres. And when windstorms come through, they can pick up this dust and carry it for hundreds of miles, blanketing everything in its path. These were called black blizzards, and people would breathe in this dust and get so sick that they had something called dust pneumonia, which could actually kill people. Because of the Dust Bowl, a lot of farmers cannot farm. That means that banks are foreclosing on their houses because they can't pay their mortgages. So this results in a big migration of plain states farmers out west to work mostly in California, which was a center of agribusiness and potentially provided or could provide a lot of jobs. Most of them drove to California along Route 66, which is why that route is so well known in American culture. And because many of them came from Oklahoma, they tended to earn the name Okies. By the way, a best-selling novel of the time by John Steinbeck called The Grapes of Wrath is based on the experience of Okies fleeing the Dust Bowl for new lives and new jobs in California. Next, as part of the 100 days, Roosevelt's administration pushes through the 21st Amendment, and that will serve to repeal prohibition, which at this point had been criticized as anti-immigrant, it had been criticized as anti, basic American freedom, that it had encouraged crime and lawlessness, and also that it was perhaps damaging to the economy. So the 21st Amendment will repeal the 18th Amendment, which had established prohibition. Finally, here we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, something still with us today, very much like the FDIC. But its job is to regulate stock market practices, to try to cut down on the reckless investing, speculation, and buying on margin, which had become common in the 1920s and greatly contributed to the market crash. So what the SEC is effectively doing is putting in place regulations that will prevent a stock market crash again in the future. So the first New Deal, first 100 days, despite successes, was also constitutionally dubious. Uh, at least that was the opinion of the Supreme Court. So the first New Deal is effectively halted after several parts of it are declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, including the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA. So the Supreme Court stands as kind of an obstacle to FDR's pursuit of his New Deal policies and are in large part responsible for preventing its continuation. Question number 2, who were the main proponents of economic justice in the 1930s and what measures did they advocate? So there are a number of groups and individuals to talk about here. And keep in mind that we are in an era that is the worst economic downturn in American history, so there is increased public support for what we would deem to be economic justice at the time. The labor unions, still in existence, certainly fought for better conditions for workers, but now, during the New Deal, they find they had the full support of the federal government. The NRA gave them an equal place at the table to negotiate fair labor practices and business practices. And another law that we'll talk about in a bit, called the Wagner Act, helped to legitimize the very existence of labor unions and the kinds of practices they engaged in. So union membership during the New Deal is going to grow substantially because they now have the support of the federal government, whereas in the past, the federal government had largely been hostile toward labor. In a new labor union that emerges in the 1930s is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO. It's led by John Lewis, and it actually used to be part of the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. It had been a committee that had proposed that the AFL should begin to unionize unskilled laborers as well. And the AFL had been exclusive to skilled workers in craft fields. This ideological split led the CIO to become its own labor union, and they will organize unskilled and semi-skilled workers in manufacturing fields, notably in the steel industry and in the automobile industry. Also notable about the CIO is they pioneered a new form of strike called the sit-down strike, where workers would refuse to work just as you would in any other strike, but then they refuse to vacate or leave the factory floor, literally sitting down in most cases. And the reason they do this is because by not walking out, they prevent their own replacement by so-called scabs, or temporary workers who are coming in to take the jobs of striking workers. There is a pretty large and very effective use of the sit-down strike at a General Motors General Motors factories in Flint, Michigan in the 1930s, led by the CIO. As for individuals, there are a series of reformers in the 1930s that called for even more radical action than the New Deal had already offered. And for many critics, at least, the New Deal was already pretty radical. But these that we're about to talk about are not saying that the New Deal goes too far, but rather they're alleging that the New Deal doesn't go far enough. One of those folks is Upton Sinclair, the writer of The Jungle, our old muckraking friend from the Progressive era. In 1934, he's going to run for governor of California as a socialist. He won't win, he'll do pretty well. But importantly, he called for the state government of California to create jobs for the unemployed and to create a social assistance program, very like what will become Social Security later on. So he gets a lot of support in his campaign for those programs, and those kinds of things will be influential on pushing the New Deal further to the left in a more liberal, more arguably radical position. Another reformer who is also proposing more radical reform that's going to push the New Deal more leftward is Huey P. Long. Huey Long is also known as the Kingfish, was a politician from Louisiana. He was a reformist governor and then later on a senator, and he campaigned on a so-called Share Our Wealth Society or Share Our Wealth movement, and it called for a really radical redistribution of American wealth that included actually limiting the amount of money that the wealthy could have, that after a certain amount, and I believe it was $15 million, which was an astronomical sum at the time. I believe it translates to something like 800 some odd million today. So it's a lot of money. But he said any money that one makes after 15 million will be taxed at 100%. That way, the government could redirect that money to help the poor and set not only a basement on how poor people can get, how low they can fall, but in doing so, also creating a ceiling on how high and how wealthy people can get to try to create a more just and more just society that shares the wealth. He potentially posed a electoral threat to FDR and may have challenged him for the nomination for the Democratic Party in 1936, but he'll actually be assassinated by a former staffer before he can actually mount that presidential bid. As a result, FDR doesn't have any kind of primary challenge in the election, and that'll help him get elected. The third reformer that is pushing the New Deal and FDR further to the left is a Catholic priest by the name of Father Charles E. Coughlin. And he had a popular radio show, and he used that to call for greater reform. Importantly, he's calling for government ownership of key industries, which is a very socialistic kind of reform proposal. And at first, he's a big supporter of FDR, but he increasingly criticized the New Deal as being ineffective and not going far enough. So again, we have another reformer that is helping to push the New Deal further to the left. Question number 3, what were the major initiatives of the second New Deal, and how did they differ from the first New Deal? So with FDR's re-election, he's going to pursue a more radical version of the New Deal in his second term. And the second New Deal will be focused less on economic recovery from the Great Depression and more on economic security moving forward. And this development, this shift in focus, is largely the result of calls for more radical action from people like Huey Long, Upton Sinclair, Charles E. Coughlin, and others. Importantly, the second New Deal will make much greater use of an economic theory called Keynesianism, or Keynesian economics, and it's spelled Keynesien. It's named after a British economist of last name Keynes, and the basic idea is that in times of economic hardship, the government should engage in massive spending, even spending themselves into debt in order to promote economic growth. And the government had already experimented with this a little bit with the CCC, so they're engaged in a lot of spending to pay these workers who they've created jobs for, but are spending themselves into debt. But still, the purpose is to try to create economic growth. And we'll see that accelerate a lot in this second New Deal. The very best example of this is the WPA, or Works Progress Administration. This is an enormous government jobs program that employed over 3 million American workers in a variety of jobs, everything from construction jobs to medical jobs, even helping to pay for artists to have jobs, writing plays, painting murals, etc. So this is massive government spending aimed at economic growth by putting people back to work. All the while, the government is spending money that they don't really have, thus spending themselves into debt. Again, once the economy recovers, Keynesian economics says that the government will be able to recoup that money in taxes because more people will now qualify to pay taxes. Next, another major initiative of the Second New Deal is the Wagner Act. This is a law that is also known as the Magna Carta of Labor. But this is another example of the federal government's newfound support for labor unions. The Wagner Act, signed in 1935, will ensure workers' rights to organize and to bargain collectively. In other words, this legitimizes the very existence of labor unions and the practices they use to try to get concessions from their employers. And the Wagner Act, along with the NRA, manages to substantially raise union membership during this period. A major initiative of the Second New Deal, and one that probably is the best example of its new focus on economic security, is the Social Security Act. Social Security Act is going to create a federal pension system for retirees that is funded by taxes on workers' wages. So workers will pay a little bit out of their monthly check toward this, and on top of that, their employer has to pay an equivalent contribution as well. So whereas you might have, I don't know, 10 cents taken out of your paycheck, your employer has to also match that in taxes to the government. And all of this goes into a pool that is invested very safely. And then when you retire, you're eligible to get a monthly check from that fund. So it's not welfare in the sense that you didn't put into this but are still claiming it. This is money that individuals worked to give themselves. It's just sort of held on to and invested by the government in the meantime. And this is going to have a dramatic effect on American poverty. Most poor Americans at the time were the elderly, who had not managed to save up enough money for retirement and could no longer work for the most part. The Social Security Act and this monthly pension to retirees is going to go a long way at reducing poverty in the United States, and it still does today. That said, at first, the Social Security Act did not cover domestic and agricultural workers. And that meant that it had the effect of excluding very large numbers of women and African Americans, because those were the chief fields in which those groups worked. The Social Security Act is going to launch the American version of the so-called welfare state. A welfare state, what that means is that the government engages in a system of income assistance and social services for everyone. So it's helping everyone across the board so it's aiming at the welfare of all of society. This dramatically changes the idea of the function of government. So intervention in the economy is now accepted by the American, or a majority of the American people, and in fact now is expected by most of the American people. So if progressivism signaled the coming end of laissez-faire, The New Deal is the last nail in the coffin of that old American idea that the government should be completely hands off with the economy. We never returned to that after the New Deal. And in fact, many elements of the New Deal are still in place, including the Social Security Administration. Question number 4, how did the New Deal recast the meaning of American freedom? The New Deal encouraged a large government that would work toward ensuring social and economic liberty. It's an inheritor of the old progressive tradition, and it is, in fact, the roots of modern liberal ideology. And FDR was able to sell this pretty radical change to the American people because he was an effective communicator. And he was able to effectively communicate the benefits of this welfare state and the individual policies he was proposing, usually through what were called fireside chats. These were radio broadcasts where the president spoke directly to the American people in a kind of plain spoken everyday language. And it was sort of like you were sitting around just having a conversation at the fireside, hence fireside chats. But this was a really effective public communication tool that was different from anything, and this use of the media was different from anything that had come before. And it is perhaps the biggest asset that FDR has when trying to drum up public support for these programs. Now, this new concept, this new idea of American freedom was not without its critics. Um, Certainly, there were Americans who feared big government. It is an American tradition to be at least skeptical of big government, believing that the larger and more powerful it gets, the greater threat it may pose to your liberty. So one organization that were critics of the New Deal were the American Liberty League. And they accused or alleged that the New Deal effectively was creeping socialism or even communism, which, again, most historians would disagree with. Nonetheless, they were probably, this organization, the American Liberty League, were the face of opponents to the New Deal. And the Republican Party largely adopted this kind of stance too. Uh, the 1936 election sees a Republican candidate named Alfred Landon challenging FDR, alleging that his New Deal programs were a threat to individual liberty. As you, and the blue and red are switched here, but as you can see, the American people generally disagreed with Mr. Landon. He only won 2 states, Maine and Vermont, and Roosevelt won the remaining 46. So in another electoral landslide, American people are expressing their desire for a more activist government that provides this kind of welfare state for economic security. Importantly, though, FDR will win with the help of what's called the New Deal Coalition. All this means is that he has put together a new coalition or combination of voters that are going to give him a majority every time. It's a collection of different groups who are now all going to vote reliably Democratic for the foreseeable future. In fact, nearly the next 50 years. So the New Deal coalition included Southern whites who were already Democratic, industrial workers who were directly benefiting from New Deal programs, ethnic minorities like Catholics and Jews, and importantly, African Americans who had, since the 15th Amendment, had, as a voter bloc, voted reliably Republican. The Republican Party, after all, was the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation, the party of Reconstruction. But by the 1930s, we begin to see a shift as New Deal policies are perceived to benefit African Americans more than Republican policies are. And even today, African Americans as a voter bloc remain reliably Democratic. And really, the New Deal coalition is largely still intact, with the exception that Southern whites no longer tend to vote Democratic. Nonetheless, the New Deal coalition, beginning in the 1930s, is going to allow for the Democratic Party to largely dominate politics for the next half century, really. Now, one thing that did lose Roosevelt some support and perhaps raises questions about his conception of freedom was his court packing scheme. Roosevelt's court packing scheme sought to make the Supreme Court more supportive of his New Deal policies. So he attempts to pack the court by adding new justices to the court. In fact, adding enough to give him a majority in future Supreme Court, or rather, a majority of justices sympathetic to the New Deal in future Supreme Court decisions. And remember, the Supreme Court had served as a primary obstacle to New Deal programs, declaring some programs like the AAA and the NRA to be unconstitutional. This scheme was widely criticized, and it was ultimately rejected by Congress. So FDR sends this bill to Congress. Congress does not pass it into law. He gets criticism from both the Republican Party and his own Democratic Party, and that's going to allow for Republicans to regain some lost political ground. That said, Roosevelt remains popular and will ultimately be elected to 4 terms in office. And in that way, he kind of gets the last laugh when it comes to the Supreme Court, because for the rest of Roosevelt's administration, the court actually tended to uphold Roosevelt's New Deal policies, because by the time Roosevelt died in office, he is responsible for replacing 7 justices on the court who either die or retire. So the longer he's in there, the greater ability he has to appoint new justices by filling vacancies. So by the end of it, he's able to reshape the court in the long run rather than the short run as the court packing scheme had sought. Question number 5, how did New Deal benefits apply to women and minorities? In the case of women, the New Deal sees more women serving in government roles than ever before. A great example of this is Frances Perkins, who becomes the Secretary of Labor and was a direct advisor to the president on issues of labor and unionization, which was certainly a central focus of the New Deal. We also have the wife of FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt, who introduces the concept of an activist first lady. So rather than just sort of keeping house as previous first ladies had done, she is an active advocate for economic justice and even racial justice to a degree, and sets the standard for future first ladies to do the same. Now, during the New Deal, really the Great Depression and New Deal, the women's movement, as it had been, essentially disappears. There were widespread calls for women to leave the workplace in order to make room for unemployed men. And because the Social Security Administration excluded most women because they didn't work outside the home, it meant they couldn't tax their wages. So you have, and also, pretty importantly, I should have added this, with the passage of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, the women's rights movement is really kind of rudderless. There's no agreement across the movement about what future goals should be. And many women felt that with the 19th Amendment, it was mission accomplished. And now they could vote into office politicians who would support women's rights. So the women's rights movement has essentially evaporated at this point and will not reemerge really until the 1960s. One minority group, Native Americans, benefited from New Deal policies through the so-called Indian New Deal. This is actually a law called the Indian Reorganization Act. This will end the policies of the Dawes Act. Remember, the Dawes Act ended American recognition of tribal authority, of tribal governance, tribal ownership of land. It tried to turn Native Americans into individual homesteaders, in the process getting rid of half of their land. And most notoriously, it sent between 8 and 9 out of every 10 Native American children to a boarding school in an attempt to, as one reformer put it, kill the Indian but save the man. So this Indian Reorganization Act, or Indian New Deal, will end the policies of the Dawes Act and allow tribes greater cultural autonomy. The government would now recognize tribal rights to govern their own affairs and tribal ownership of land. That said, living conditions on reservations don't significantly improve, and reservations are still notoriously the poorest places in the nation. As for Mexican Americans, demand for labor fell during the Depression, obviously, so many migrants actually returned to Mexico, and those who did remain worked mostly in agribusiness. And remember, the Social Security Act didn't apply to agricultural workers, so they don't benefit from these programs. They also don't benefit from the Wagner Act because the Wagner Act excluded agricultural workers when it came to their support of unionization. So Mexican Americans living in the American Southwest working in agribusiness largely did not benefit from New Deal programs. As for African Americans, again, the Social Security Act excluded most African Americans because it excluded domestic and agricultural workers. And this, by the way, was at the was at the insistence of Southern white congressmen who FDR needed as part of his New Deal coalition in order to keep getting reelected and passing his policies. So domestic and agricultural work were the largest categories of African American employment, and that meant that many African Americans were more and more dependent on public assistance programs or welfare. And this increasingly gets stigmatized as an unearned government handout or unearned government financial aid. And that association between welfare programs and African Americans persists for decades moving forward. But the unemployment rate of African Americans is twice that of whites during the Great Depression. So they are arguably far more at need as a group than whites are to alleviate the economic hardships of the era. But FDR, largely to keep his white Southern faction of his New Deal coalition, was largely unconcerned with economic justice and civil rights for African Americans. So New Deal construction projects in the South seldom hired African Americans, and that was up to Southerners to do the hiring for these programs. FDR never balked at these kinds of segregationist restrictions. That said, Roosevelt did appoint a record number of African Americans to government positions, still not many, but like I say, a record number. Perhaps a more significant support of civil rights for African Americans came from Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife. She publicly endorsed an anti-lynching law in Congress and befriended several NAACP leaders. She also very publicly resigned from an organization called the Daughters of the American Revolution when they barred a world-famous opera singer, Marian Anderson, from singing at Constitution Hall simply because she was Black. She very publicly resigned in protest to this, and then as First Lady managed to secure the Lincoln Memorial, which is probably a much more prestigious venue for this singer, as a new venue for her to give her performance. But the New Deal also saw federal discrimination in housing programs that will have the effect of enforcing segregation nationwide. So most cities insisted, their white city governments insisted that federally funded housing be segregated. And the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, another New Deal program, would not insure mortgages in red-lined areas. So they were color coding areas and neighborhoods as either desirable or undesirable, and of course, undesirable areas were typically labeled as such because there were largely minority populations. So because the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't insure mortgages in redlined areas, it meant that it was hard to get home loans there, and thus it's hard to build wealth over time, and this helps to exacerbate disproportionate poverty rates among African Americans, especially in urban areas. Question number 6, how did the Popular Front influence American culture in the 1930s? I really don't want to focus that much on this, and I think to a certain degree, Eric Foner is trying to create, or is perhaps sort of forcing a collective title on a series of movements and events. and the idea of a American Popular Front is not on the AP framework, so I don't want to wade into that idea all that much. But there are a number of things in this section that are worth noting that will contribute to your knowledge of the period and success on the test. So first, during the 1930s, the idea of ethnic pluralism became a reality. It's the idea of a multi-ethnic or multiracial society. We see Catholics, Jews, and new immigrants becoming more assimilated during this period. Um, we also see that, and this is partially the effect of the common experience of the Depression and the national culture that has been built by the mass media during radio and film since the 1920s. 1930s culture also saw an increased focus on themes of the common man through art, literature, film, etc. So, like Dorothea Lange's photography of migrants escaping the Dust Bowl, like Migrant Mother here on the left, or films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, in which Jimmy Stewart plays an average, everyday, common man who goes to Washington to challenge the status quo and the powers that be. A notable event that reflects racial tensions in the 1930s is the Scottsboro Boys case. Here, 9 African American teenagers between the ages of 12 and 17 are accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Alabama in 1931. They only received a 1-day trial, and the evidence was flimsy. Doctors found no evidence whatsoever of rape. Most of these young men were not even in the same train car as the alleged victims of this crime. Also, their court-appointed lawyer was the town drunk and was allegedly visibly drunk during the trial when he was supposed to be defending them. Later, one of the victims recanted their accusation of rape. The 2 women were actually prostitutes, and they were afraid of being arrested for that because an old law called the Mann Act, M-A-N-N, made it illegal to cross state lines for immoral purposes. And the train had crossed state lines. They were prostitutes, immoral. So basically, they were trying to get themselves out of trouble by playing on existing racist stereotypes and casting blame on these young men instead. The Scottsboro Boys are found guilty. One of them is sentenced to life. That's the 12-year-old. And the other 8 are sentenced to death. So this results in a series of landmark legal cases that dealt with racism and the right to a fair trial, like adequate counsel or an impartial jury of one's peers. Also worth noting, I think, about the Scottsboro Boys case is that a name that we're familiar with from later on, Rosa Parks, was present in this era and worked to free these young men, and eventually did, as an activist for the NAACP. All right, rounding things up here, why did the New Deal end? So reasons that the New Deal ended included, first, Southern Democrats, even though they were part of the New Deal coalition, feared that continued federal intervention would mean increased unionization and changes in race relations. So they began to withhold some of their support, which forced FDR to change some of his policies and strategies. Also, Northern Republicans had gained some seats in Congress off of the court packing scheme and the scandal that that resulted in. Also, the increased union militancy seen throughout the nation, well, I should say the increased union membership and the potential threat that that posed troubled enough Northerners for them to support the Republicans over the Democrats. But perhaps the most important reason that the New Deal ended was because the United States entered World War II. And although the New Deal goes a long way to alleviate the plight of the Great Depression, driving down the unemployment rate, creating conditions to prevent another depression, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. It only lessens its effects. It improves the lives of countless Americans, but we're still in the Depression. World War II will have the effect of putting so many Americans back to work and bolstering the economy that will firmly bring us out of the Great Depression. And we'll deal with that in the next chapter, which is, of course, about World War II.